The Russian economy is just fine. At least that's the gist of what President Vladimir Putin said last week in a speech at an event in St. Petersburg. But are sanctions actually starting to bite, or have they only served to blow back on Europe and America? Well, this is DW Business Q&A, where we'll ask the experts your questions. 4 months into the war with Ukraine, there are indeed some head-scratchers. The ruble is in a better position against the US dollar than at the start of the war. Russian revenues from energy exports like gas and oil are up, and they even took over McDonald's across the country. But is it really so simple? I'm Daniel Winter, and thank you very much for joining me. And also joining me, I've got two experts to help me peek behind the curtain. Emily Sherwin is our former Moscow correspondent, and you've spoken to people from the Russian government and reported there for a long time. And yeah, the Russian government essentially forced you out, and the other reporters from DW's Moscow bureau, and forced you to leave. But you're here. That's the most important thing. She joins me here in the studio. And Maria Shagina researches sanctions at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and she joins us from Zurich. Thank you very much, Maria, for joining us as well. And if you're watching this live, now is your turn to ask any burning questions you have on Russia and its economy. Just post them in the live chat and we'll ask our guests. So let's get started. We'll be taking a few user questions live in just a few minutes. But first, I want to start with a look at what's happening right now in Russia with the currency, the ruble. After an initial slump in March, it hit a 7-year high against the US dollar this week and is up 35% this year. Let's see it from the perspective of the US dollar. On February 24th, $1 could buy about 80 rubles. Sanctions quickly affected the Russian currency. On March the 14th, $1 could buy just under 117 rubles. At the end of March, its value recovered. Since then, the dollar buying kept falling until the all-time record of 56.3 rubles to 1 US dollar recorded on June the 21st. So, yeah, it's a very difficult situation for the ruble, but now it's bounced back. It's really difficult to decipher what's going on here. But you know, you've been out of Moscow for a few months now, but you're still in contact with people on the ground. You still monitor the situation there. So people in Russia have seen prices whipsaw all over the place for their daily goods, everything that they're buying on a day-to-day basis. What's the general feeling among Russians right now?
I think it's a bit of a mixed bag, as usual. You know, you have on the one hand people who are worried still, I think, but also there's a lot of defiance. You know, initially you mentioned the shock of this on the economy, and that also affected prices. Prices went up. There was some panic buying. There was a lot of, you know, shock and worry among the Russian population. We saw pictures of, you know, people standing in line outside of ATMs trying to get out dollars and euros, trying to also buy products at Western chains that were leaving the country. That was also, you know, there were lines outside of stores as well. Now I think things are kind of stabilizing a little bit, and surveys also show that. So there are surveys from May from the independent pollster Levada Center, which show that people are less concerned now about Western sanctions than they were back in February. So back in February, 46% said that they were very worried or a little bit worried. Now it's gone down to 38%. So people are still pretty worried, but getting a little bit less worried, I would say. And actually, 3/4 of people say that Russia should continue its political course no matter what happens and regardless of Western sanctions. So you can see that kind of defiance that I think is very strong. It has been very strong in the Russian narrative for quite a long time now. People say we're surrounded by enemies, but it doesn't matter. We'll defeat them. We'll show them that we're strong anyway. And I think that very much applies to the sanctions now as well.
It's really interesting because a lot of the time in business news we deal with numbers and we deal with supranational organizations and all of this other kind of stuff. It's very far away from the people. But here we have seen the narrative that's going on when you look at the charts reflected in how people are feeling on the ground. It really is something tangible. But Maria, I'd like to turn to you now and just ask, what has gone on with the ruble? It has staged a rapid recovery, and not even just a recovery, but strengthened further than it was at the start of the war. How has this happened?
The miraculous rebound of the ruble is obviously the story that the Russian government very much would like to underline, that everything is stabilized. The Fortress Russia strategy that was put in place in 2014 is back up and running. It has been rebuilt with the unprecedented windfall from energy, hydrocarbons, that, as was said, everything is fine, everything is normal. But the ruble, the exchange on the ruble is artificially maintained. So without the micromanagement from the central bank and rather skillful intervention from the Russian officials, the exchange rate might not be the same tomorrow or in a couple of weeks. So this is the story of stabilization that Russia wants to portray, but this is only half or less half of the sanctions story and where the sanctions are working. The other piece of this puzzle is imports. And we've seen unprecedented drastic fall of imports, not just from sanctioned countries, but also non-sanctioned countries like China. The imports from China fell by 40%, from South Korea, Taiwan, who are responsible for export of semiconductors, chips, fell by 70%. So while Russia is accruing this hard currency from the export of hydrocarbons, it has nowhere to spend it. And this is the situation it has locked itself in. And as you said, the ruble has strengthened so much that it's now detrimental to Russian exporters, which usually favor a much weaker currency when they export the energy commodities to Europe. So this is only half of the story. How to evaluate it, definitely something that the Russian government wants to underline it. But the strengthening of the ruble also serves towards the purpose to curb inflation. The Russian government doesn't want ordinary Russians to feel any pain, to feel any change. They don't even say that this is the war happening. The same with the currency and inflation. They don't want ordinary Russians to see that something is different. But apart from the polls that were cited here, that 50% of Russians maybe don't care about sanctions, there are another indications that more than 70% of Russians don't plan any big purchases. So the fact that something is changing is gradually sinking in.
Okay, so it's starting to sink in, and Putin is selling this rise in the ruble as a success. But as you say, there's more to it than that. And we have a question here from Lisa, and she says, how long can the artificial life supports, which you just mentioned, on the ruble be maintained? What do you think?
The central bank government, as I said, has introduced quite skillful interventions in terms of aggressive capital controls. It has also put cash on withdrawals to absorb any shock effect that was in the first weeks, where more than $10 billion were withdrawn just over the weekend. So that strengthening of the ruble was very important. But as I said, there has been now a couple of stages where interest rate has been lowered now from 20% in the first days of the war to 9% now. There's been gradual relaxation of what can be transferred and dealt in terms of hard currency. And the central bank governor, Elvina Nabiullina, is worried about the strengthening of the ruble. As I said, it doesn't serve well the Russian economy at all.
Okay, and I'd like to turn now back to Emily. So how does this feel for the average Russian when they go into the supermarket, when they go out to buy something? Where does this rise in prices actually affect the average person?
So a lot of experts are talking about how the effect on the Russian consumer and on Russian people will actually come later. So initially people were saying in the summer, now some people are saying more like in the autumn. I think initially, we were talking about price rises just after the war began. When that shock first started, prices went up, including on basic food goods like buckwheat, which is a favorite among Russians. But that may have been down to kind of panic buying. That's what a lot of people said, that that was actually what was pushing the prices up. But of course, in the long term, Russia has been almost, very much cut off from the global economy, from its previous supply chains, and that means that certain things are going to vanish from the shelves or are already vanishing from the shelves. There have been some shortages already. People have been complaining about price rises in medications or even some medications vanishing. Again, it's still not quite clear whether that's because of panic buying or whether it's those supply chains. But I think, we will find out soon what the effect on Russian people is, and I think people will start feeling it.
OK, so there's more pain potentially to come. But I'd like to now hear from the man at the top. Last week, talking at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, the Russian Davos, as some call it, President Putin blamed global inflation on the economic policies of the G7 countries, denying that his special operation, as he calls it, or as we would call it, the war in Ukraine, has anything to do with soaring prices of fuel and food worldwide. Take a listen.
Russia and our actions in Donbass have nothing to do with global instability. Today's inflation, problems with food security, fuel and the energy sector in general are the result of mistakes by the US administration and the EU bureaucracy. The world was driven into this situation by the irresponsible macroeconomic policy of the countries of the G7, including the uncontrollable emission and accumulation of unsecured debt.
So, Emily, he's right, isn't he? So not, of course, he started the war in Ukraine. That is entirely his fault. But Europe did a lot to connect its economy, its dependence on energy, dependence on foodstuffs that are grown in Russia. Europe brought them closer together. And I can think of one example from Germany, Angela Merkel's promotion of the Nord Stream pipeline as well. Her idea being, if we bring Russia into the boat, then they'll move towards a better, healthier democracy with Germany. But that failed. So in a way, Europe is to blame for this shock, this price shock that we found ourselves in. What do you think about that?
Well, certainly the idea that people like Angela Merkel supported, that if we keep talking to Russia, we keep trading with Russia, they'll kind of stay within the existing political order. That seems to have definitely backfired. And, even now, the EU is very much dependent on Russia when it comes to gas imports. 40% of gas still comes from Russia in the EU. And, of course, the EU has vowed to reduce that dependency, but that process will be slow. And Russia knows that. And I think at the moment what we're seeing is almost Russia throwing its weight around a little bit, saying, we know that you need our gas. And, we saw measures like, for example, the Russian gas giant Gazprom, which is largely state-owned, stopping gas exports to Bulgaria, to Poland, to Finland, saying, we want to be paid in rubles, a condition which essentially they know that Europe can't fulfill. Then we also saw recently that gas supplies were reduced to Germany via Nord Stream 1, that pipeline. And there's always a sense, on the one hand, you have the official justification from the Russians, which is usually a technical thing. In the case of the Nord Stream, it was, technical difficulties or contract difficulties. Yeah. But we know that there's a political dimension to this, of course, as well. And, we heard Putin talking about Western economic policies being at fault. And there's very much a sense in Russia, I think, that the West has started a war with these sanctions against Russia. In his speech as well, Putin talked about an economic blitzkrieg against Russia. People keep saying that the West is Russophobic and that essentially the sanctions almost prove that the West is involved in Ukraine as well, and that Russia is fighting against the West in Ukraine on that front.
It's a bit rich when it comes from him that it's Europe's fault that they're in this situation. Of course, it was an act of aggression that if that hadn't happened, we wouldn't be in this situation at all anyway. So, these days we know that any country that seeks to just survive by itself, alone as an island, it doesn't work. You have to create and build bridges with other nations. And that's what Europe sought to do with Russia. But it seems to have, I guess, backfired in a way. We didn't have an exit plan, I guess, is the problem. But I'd like to turn to you again, Maria. As Europe weans itself off Russian oil and gas, how hard is that expected to hit the Russian economy? Because so far they seem quite blasé about the whole situation and about the sanctions even. But as Europe turns off the taps from its end, is that going to hit Russia hard?
The absence of any energy sanctions has been the weakest spot of the current sanctions regime. We talked about unprecedented sanctions on freezing central bank assets, targeting Sberbank and other major financial institutions in Russia. But since the start of the war, Europe has sent over $60 billion to Russia. And this, in fact, contradicts the objective of sanctions, which is to erode Russia's ability to fund the war. So we are in a situation where Europe is in a very tight spot to find any alternatives, because it was just discussed. It was a comfortable situation, in particular for Germany, to tie itself to this energy bridge to Russia. It was cheap, it was convenient, infrastructure was there in place. There was less need to build new bridges, as you said, to other countries. So that path dependency remained for quite a while. Now Europe is in a situation where it needs to change it, but its lack of domestic resilience stops it from imposing gas embargo. So we heard that the EU announced an oil embargo. It's a major step up in terms of targeting the Russian economy. It receives, the oil sector has been a cash cow for the Russian economy, but it has also the mechanism that has been chosen is an embargo, phased out embargo that will be triggered in December. It has spiked the prices. So the Europe is eager to go that extra mile to find other suppliers, and in oil it's much easier to do. But also in terms of gas, it will be much difficult to do. And Russia knows that there is this very narrow time frame where it can weaponize energy supplies to Europe, in particular to Germany. And as was said, it cut the gas supplies via Nord Stream 1 by 60%. But in terms of the sanctions and hitting Russian economy, that is the key element that has been missing. But in terms of the design, we'll see the impact rather next year than this one.
OK, so you think that certainly Europe could be doing a lot more by the sounds of it. And we'll talk about those other partners that could buy Russian oil a little bit later. But I'd like to turn back to you, Emily. You were nodding your head there. I mean, you've seen the criticism that's been levelled at Europe. They really should be doing more. Why aren't they doing more?
Well, because they were too dependent for too long. I mean, 40%, I was saying, 40% of EU gas is from Russia. That's a huge chunk. And it makes sense that it would take a while for them to wean themselves off that. And as I was saying, Russia knows that it has the upper hand there, I think. OK, and Alexander asks for you, Maria. How can sanctions work if the EU is only going to stop buying oil by the new year? By then, Russia will already have redirected its oil routes to Asia. Is it as simple and as clear as that, Maria?
I don't think it's as simple as that, but there is certainly this time which is of the essence, not just for Ukraine when it fights Russian aggression, but also for Russia to reestablish this new supply chains to China, to India. And here there are two factors that needs to be taken into account. Is infrastructure bottlenecks, logistical challenges, and they're definitely there because India is miles away and doesn't have the established infrastructure. China is eager to take more Russian oil, but also there are new investments that are needed to put in place to ramp up those exports. And both countries, we should say, are very eager to capitalize on Russia's isolation. So the current discounts on Russian crude oil are rather unprecedented. It's more than $35 per barrel, whereas the Brent, the US Brent crude is traded around more than $110 per barrel. So Russia is exporting more to China and India, but at its own detrimental to its own budget. And also the second factor here is demand from those countries. Because China is, unlike the EU, which is 40% dependent on Russian gas, a bit less on oil, has the policy of diversification. It has a cap that no supplier, the share of any supplier should be more than 15%. So it's eager to keep those different countries, whether it's Russia or Saudi Arabia, in check. It doesn't want to put all eggs in one basket. So there is also limitations on the demand, how much those countries like China, also India, can import from Russia.
Okay. And now just turning quickly back to you, Emily, we have a question from the boring millennial. Remember, fantastic username, by the way. And if you want to write in your questions, send them in, put them in the live chat, and we'll ask our experts here. They say, while Germany has returned to coal to make up for Russian gas, is there a serious plan towards more work and faster adoption of renewable energy sources like wind and solar in order to get off Russian gas? Where is Germany at with its mega energy transition, which, it's been a long time in the making?
Yeah, it's definitely a step backwards, that Germany, among other countries, is talking about returning to coal. We did hear Ursula von der Leyen from the EU talking about weaning the EU off Russian gas, and part of the plan there is also to switch to more renewables like solar and wind. But again, this is a long process. So I think the EU does want to do that, but they stayed reliant on Russian oil and gas, I think, for too long and didn't fulfill their green promises fast enough, I think.
Yeah, the EU has set this mega target to reduce dependence on Russian oil and gas, even though not all countries have signed up to all aspects. But that requires, at every single level, right down to the local level, everyone being on board. That sounds like a nightmare. Is it even realistic?
I don't know. I mean, there's always a bunch of infighting in the EU, people agreeing, disagreeing. Hungary has been known recently to block some measures as well. So I'm sure this will be a bit of a logistical nightmare, but hopefully, in the past few months, we have seen a fairly united Europe, considering united because of the war in Ukraine. So potentially this could also get people on one page, but we'll have to see, I guess.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see on that, that's for sure. Well, let's move on now. Russian authorities are keenly aware that if they want to increase domestic manufacturing, there has to be consumers to buy those products. And the head of the Russian central bank has called for more domestic consumption. Let's hear what she had to say.
Russia has earned a lot of foreign currency revenues from exports, but if there are only exports and no imports, Russia will be forced to put the money into risk-prone investments. Therefore, Russia needs to adjust its industrial structure by shifting to the domestic market, shoring up production, and revitalizing the manufacturing industry.
So, Maria, what does that mean, shifting to the domestic market? And how would that work?
That is, in fact, the key question. So despite all the hubristic statements at the forum that everything is fine, sanctions are not working, the key question was actually addressed in St. Petersburg. How to reform Russia's economic model and whether it can leapfrog from potential degradation to modernization against the background where the sanctions environment is tightening and the more than 1,300 companies are withdrawing from Russia. So how to build a new fundamental economy for Russia to survive all of this? And this question really needs to be addressed by Russian officials, whether they will be able to structurally transform it without really access to foreign capital, at least to Western capital, is a big question mark. Russia has been embarking on the policy of import substitution since 2014 to exactly address the problem of manufacturing on too much reliance on Western suppliers, and it hasn't achieved so much. And now we see that they can't even import nails or buttons, as was said by Russian officials, but more substantially advanced technologies for the energy sector, critical parts as chips and semiconductors. And those are the key items for any modern economies. So here it goes back to the previous question, whether non-aligned countries like China, India, Turkey, Saudi Arabia can step in and provide this capital. Because it's one thing to stabilize your financial system, but it's the other thing to allow this financial system to conduit, to process capital that is at the moment not there.
Okay, Maria, I'd like to ask you another question that comes from Max, who's watching right now. Maybe this is a bit specialist, but I don't know what you can add on this. Who is going to service Russian airline fleets, basically? So if all of these sanctions are taking effect against specific industries, specific companies, cutting off these supply chains with the West that were just so essential before and so just taken for granted, what does Russia do now with this critical infrastructure that they have to maintain?
The aviation sector, on par with car industry, have been hit the most. And those are again, advanced parts and advanced critical materials that Russia doesn't produce domestically. So they are under a big task how to transform that industry. There have been anecdotal evidence that they would use the parts of the Romanian Western fleet and use it for its own. But again, going back to this import substitution, it has been a failure and a couple of delays in terms of producing homemade aviation fleet. Sukhoi Superjet that was meant to substitute American Boeing or Airbus didn't progress on time, on schedule, and now against this background of tightening export controls, the prospects are rather bleak for that.
Okay, and what is it like for the chip industry? So we've seen that the whole world has struggled with chip supply chains, Maria, and you know, Russia is now going to be in an even worse situation. So it still has access to silicon chips, but perhaps not as well performant as what you might need to be able to keep up with the development of technology. How serious is that impact going to be? And I just want to say that comes from SIR, or SIR, our YouTube viewer who's watching. Maria, what do you think?
That is one of the key elements in the sanctions regime, on top with energy sanctions. Because by denying access to these chips and semiconductors, Russia is deprived, as Elvira Nabiullina, the central bank governor, described, will be forced to go reverse industrialization, meaning it will be relying more and more on less advanced technologies. And we already heard anecdotal evidence that Russia is using dishwasher chips for its military equipment. How much it's effective, I'm not a military expert to give you an expertise on that, but there is clearly a lack of this, and Russia cannot produce it domestically. Before the war, it used to ship it to Taiwan, who now joined sanctions regime. So Russia cannot even produce those chips domestically. They can produce Soviet-type chips, which are 20 years older, but this is not the modern economy, modern technology we're talking about.
Yeah, 20 years old chips are just not going to cut it, I'm afraid. But Emily, I'd like to turn back to you and ask you about the problem of brain drain. How serious is this issue?
Yeah, I was just going to add, first of all, though, to what Maria was saying about the aviation industry, there were also some reports that China has now offered to perhaps deliver some airplane parts to Russia if necessary. We'll see whether that comes to pass, but there have been some reports about that. When it comes to brain drain, I think that's an aspect to consider also when it comes to producing these microchips, along with, of course, the actual production facilities. That is a huge issue. I mean, we have heard figures from Russian authorities, essentially Russian bodies within the country, that between 50 to 70,000 IT experts have actually left the country since the beginning of the war. I mean, that is huge. And actually, we have seen also countries like Armenia, where a lot of people have gone, you know, because there aren't visas, a lot of people who are against the war or who, you know, didn't want to stay in the country, they're actually, you know, trying to create a kind of Silicon Valley, including with some of the Russian experts, I think, even though they wouldn't say that they're trying to attract Russian experts, but I think that is something that is happening. So that could also, you know, create problems going forward for the IT industry, I think, within Russia.
Yeah, it sounds like it could be a difficult time ahead for them because, I mean, we've seen the consequences of brain drain. Even East Germany experienced that once the wall came up. It struggled to retain its talent and struggled for many decades because of that afterwards. And so if they don't have the chips and they don't have the programmers and the engineers to be able to put them in devices that matter, then it's going to have a serious effect. But that's the long-term effect. We're not seeing that acutely right now. But in the long term, that's going to really make an impact.
We heard also there was, Moscow Fashion Week recently. One designer was complaining, Maria mentioned it, that they don't have buttons, they don't have the right materials, textiles, because Russia just simply doesn't produce any of that.
Well, that's
Even now.
that's difficult. Though you never know when things get difficult. That might make, be conducive to more creativity, I guess. That's the only good thing I could think of about that. But let's move on now. You mentioned China, so I'd like to pick up on these foreign partners a bit. Shunned by the Western bloc, Russia is increasingly looking at its partners in the BRICS group to revitalise its imports and exports and alleviate the hit from economic sanctions. Now, the BRICS acronym stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. The leaders of the 5 countries met on June the 23rd for the annual BRICS summit, organised in a virtual format by China. In his address, Russian President Vladimir Putin says he is rerouting trade and oil towards countries from the BRICS group of emerging economies. And Putin also commended the growing economic interchange within the BRICS, saying that trade within the bloc rose 35% in the first quarter of 2022 to $45 billion, a sentiment echoed by the Chinese President Xi Jinping, who reiterated some of Putin's talking points by calling unilateral sanctions a, quote, double-edged sword and a boomerang for the Western bloc. So, Emily, is there a perception that China, for example, it could be a natural ally for Russia, or is it a lot more complicated? I imagine it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, I would say, again, it's a bit of a mix. So I think China, in some ways, is an uneasy ally, but politically much more comfortable than the EU, even in the past, because China has never come out and criticized Russia's human rights record, which the EU, various EU countries would always do when they visited Russia. China has also not condemned the war in Ukraine in such, clear terms, at least, and they also don't actually call it an invasion within the country. They also talk about, you were saying, they repeat some of the talking points that Putin also talks about, this double-edged sword. They also talk about the idea of a multipolar world order, so essentially something that's against the U.S. dominance within the world, including within the economy. But I think, Russia has been trying to pivot towards Asia since around 2013. That was what they said back then. That's almost 10 years ago. And still, up until the war, the EU was always the main trade partner for Russia. China was second, but the EU was always the main trade partner. And now it seems like they might be forced, but there was always a sense before that, China for Russia was almost some sort of a sense of, there was some sort of a sense of fear around that. They share a long land border. They've fought in the past. There was a bit of an unease there. And when it comes to China, I think they saw Russia simply as a too small of an economic fish to really, make one of their main trade partners. So I think there's some difficulties there, but we are seeing some movement when it comes to China. After the International Economic Forum in St. Petersburg. They announced that they would be that there were new trade agreements. We don't have that much detail on them between China and Russia. So there does seem to be some movement, at least rhetorically, and I think Russia kind of doesn't have a choice anymore.
Yeah, and it's going to be a very different relationship with China than Russia had with the EU. And that might not be an ideal situation for Putin. It might not make him look very good.
Too reliable,
Yeah, too reliant on China as the main consumer of its goods, perhaps. So, Maria, I think you might be able to jump in on this one as well. Sylvester asks here, can India afford to move away from Russia? So I imagine he's talking here about, whether, India is going to have issues with its reputation with other previously friendly countries if it buys up Russian oil, perhaps, because there was the discussion about being able to sell Russian oil at a discount to India to get it on side. What do you make of this relationship with Russia and India, and perhaps the other BRICS countries and foreign partners as well? What are Russia's options here?
It is true that so far all eyes have been on China to assess how much it can help out this partner in need, sanctions partner in need. But we know, if just joining the previous discussion, that China has been very cautious not to violate the Western sanctions, because it's so much dependent on US dollar transactions that it's eager to capitalize on Russia's isolation, but to violate Western sanctions in an outright fashion, private sector always overcomplied with Western sanctions. In a way, India is an interesting country here because it has been even more assertive than China. It has showed more support. It has been rhetorically also towing this delicate line and claiming neutrality and also not supporting Ukrainian calls to join the sanctions regime. But at the moment, India is also a key country here to watch in terms of how much New Delhi can mitigate any impact of sanctions, the existing one, but also the future ones. And the oil embargo is the key one here to assess. Because India has ramped up by more than 25-fold in terms of importing Russian oil. And that is unprecedented for India, that only imported 1% of Russian oil in the past. So it's happy to import this cheap Russian crude, despite all of the discounts, despite all of the logistical problems, but it's happy to capitalize it at the moment. So far, the threat of secondary sanctions didn't dissuade India not to capitalize on that. But going forward, the US will be more bold in terms of threatening India. So far, they've used carrot approach towards New Delhi, forging new military deals with the country. But the more it capitalizes and uses these opportunities, there will be more threats of secondary sanctions. But in terms of balancing out China, and as it was said, Russia will be much more dependent on China than ever before. The asymmetrical relationship existed before, that now it will be really skewed towards China. China will dictate all of the deals. So India represents an important hedging for Russia. But in terms of its economic clout, it just can't cut it. It just can't really balance it. It's an important for Russia to have this external partner, also other Bric countries, Brazil, South Africa, but China will be the country to support Russia in this.
It's going to be a massive shift, a massive change, that's for sure. And Sylvester, thank you very much for your question. And if you have any more questions that you'd like to send in, just put them in the live chat box and we'll ask our experts here as well. And Emily, I've got a question for you. Duncan here says, BRICS does not need Russia, and this new course of action will do nothing. But is that true? Is it that simple? Do all of these nations, Brazil, South Africa, China, India, and so on, do they need Russia, or is it much more the other way around, that Russia has to be able to, let's say, cut some deals, perhaps take some hits in order to offer themselves up to these other countries, to find some friendly nations in the world that will work with them, and ones with significant economic heft behind them?
Well, I think, Russia
Sorry,
certainly...
it's a big question.
Yeah,
Massive,
big question.
impossible question to answer, but I'm going to give it to you.
Russia, absolutely is in kind of a vulnerable position, even though we wouldn't know it listening to Vladimir Putin and the rhetoric coming out of Moscow. But they are looking for new partners and to strengthen relationships, including with the BRICS countries. I think that even before, but now especially since the war, Vladimir Putin has been emphasizing the importance of formats such as the BRICS. And part of that also started earlier. Like, Maria was talking about the fact that sanctions have been affecting the Russian economy since 2014. And a lot of what we've seen, this sort of pivot to import substitution, and also the pivot to talking about the importance of BRICS, the importance of other partners, the idea of pivoting to Asia, that all is kind of linked up, I think, with the sanctions. And that has been a trend that Russia, within its foreign policy has been kind of pursuing for some time. But of course, there's a lot more urgency to that trend now. So I think, yes, probably right now, Russia needs the other countries more than they need it. But, Russia's economy is important, at least when it comes to oil and resources for the world.
Yeah, we do need to put this in the context of what happened in 2014 with Russia's first invasion of Ukraine. and what's happened since then. So we tend to think about the big date as being in February. That's when the invasion happened, but it's actually been quite a long time coming by the looks of it. And certainly Russia has tried to pivot itself accordingly. But we're getting close to the end now. So I want to come back to this thought of sanctions. And so, Emily, what do you think? Here's Tony has said, with 30 affluent Western countries sanctioning Russia, and just Russia by itself sanctioning the West, all by itself, it is obvious, says Tony, that Russia will lose. My question is, how long until normal Russians feel it for real? Because at the moment, like you said, the optimism is slightly coming back up again. When are they going to feel the consequences of all of these sanctions hitting, of oil and gas revenue being cut off, of these Western countries leaving supply chains, all of these things we've talked about? When's it going to hit home?
The effect, I think, is trickling in bit by bit. Maria was talking about the central bank taking measures to stabilize the Russian economy that have been pretty successful. The IMF predicts that the Russian economy this year will shrink by around 8% to 9%. Russian figures at the moment also predict around that number. So, you know, that's pretty significant. The thing is, for Russian consumers or for Russian people, wages for them have been falling for years now. Things are getting worse. The Russian government has taken some measures within the country to at least kind of reach out to to Putin's core supporters. So they've instituted some measures that are coming in June and July to raise pensions, to raise the living wage, and to kind of create a little bit of at least a sense of economic stability. How long it will take for those sanctions to hit, I think, is probably more of a question to Maria as the expert here when it comes to the figures on the economy.
Well, I would like to ask Maria about that, because you're absolutely right. In fact, we have a couple of questions here as well, which, Maria, you might be able to answer. Perhaps slightly more philosophical than economic technical, but let's see how you feel about them. So BB says, have sanctions in the world ever worked really well? Because we have seen sanctions fail in the past. And some could say we certainly haven't got the short-term effect that Europe had expected. And then Glenn says, Russia is spending close to $1 billion a day on its disastrous war against Ukraine. How long will the Russian people support this criminal war? And what is Russia's exit strategy? That's Glenn, who's watching us right now. What do you think, Maria?
That is the key question, the quintessential question, whether sanctions are working. And we need to unpack that word working, what we mean under this. And that goes back to the objective of sanctions. This time is a slight lower objective, if you want. It's not about the behavioral change in the Kremlin. It's not about changing Putin's calculus on this. It's about eroding Russia's ability to fund the war, right? So the energy sanctions here are very much the key to target it. When it will trickle down, and here the discussion usually pivots towards the macroeconomics, whether we see, GDP contracting, is it 9% or 15% as was originally predicted. And it's part of the sanctions analysis, but it's also sanctions are often about microeconomics, disruption of supply chains, that you cannot access capital in the West. It's things that are trickling down and they are accumulating over time. So the long-term perspective here is very important to keep in mind. And for the Russian government, as we said, it's important to keep this perspective, this narrative that nothing has changed. So inflation, curbing inflation is important, raising wages is important, but this will have to happen in a situation where the economic pie is shrinking. So far, the social contract between the Russian government and its population was, we provide you relatively good living of standards for post-Soviet countries, and you don't interfere in the politics. This social contract has been tensing, has been straining, wearing very thinly. When this fear will turn into anger, it's very hard to predict. It's probably the question to sociologists as any economists or political scientists. But the strains will be there because you will have to chip in for people in poverty, in households that has been already feeling the pressure from this shrinking pie since 2014, and whether the Russian government will have enough capital to cover all of the tables, all of the stocks is the main question here.
Okay, well, that was a fantastically detailed and wonderfully economic answer to a philosophical question. But of course, you get that from an economist. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. And that brings us nicely, actually, to the end. So that's all for this Q&A, looking at the situation for the Russian economy. And I'd like to thank our guests as well. Emily Sherwin, our former Moscow correspondent, and thank you very much for coming in and speaking with us about that. Thanks. Absolutely fantastic. And Maria Shagina of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Berlin, who is joining us from Zurich. Maria, thank you very much as well. And if you've enjoyed the stream, stick around on our YouTube channel and check out some of our other videos as well. And I can highly recommend our Business Beyond series if you want more topics like this one. From the whole team here in Berlin, thank you very much for watching. So.